Many areas around the world are known to be radioactive. When they were exposed to the world, a lot of chilling secrets started pouring out of the dark. They were enough to keep people thousands of feet away from the fatal zones. What are they? What are some of the mysteries they hold? Let's find out. The most irradiated areas in Paris. The fort has a long history of being contaminated with radioactive waste. The consistent buildup of the radioactive matter caused a wave of contamination that can be felt even today. Marie Curie had discovered radium, but its effects had left a toll on her. Later, her daughter wanted to follow in the same footsteps. So, Irène Joliot-Curie and her husband, Frédéric, carried out radioactive experiments in the 1920s and 30s inside this fort. Then, years later, the army wanted to test out their nuclear power to use them against Algeria. So they started a series of secret experiments in the same fort. This left the building contaminated. The government stood up to clean the area, but the action didn't come until decades later. Finally, decontamination took place in the 1990s. Around 60 barrels of nuclear waste was carried out of the fort during the cleanup, but it was still not enough. Many areas around the fort sent a haunted chill down the spine. Plus, a total of 160,000 gallons of contaminated soil was discovered in the area. Since the lab was working secretly, a large number of cancer cases were reported in the nearby vicinity. A lot of doctors and experts couldn't figure out the cause for decades until the damage was done, and it was too late. The fort stands erect today with an automobile salvage ground present at the back of the building. Around the building, the development of other homes and new facilities has been stopped to protect the inhabitants nearby from inhaling more radiation than necessary. This has left the fort haunted. Not only is it abandoned, but you may get an eerie feeling just walking down the fort. On top of that, you might get contaminated. You can still feel the effects of the contamination wafting in the air and filling up the atmosphere of the region. Nobody would dare visit the area, the most nuked site in Kazakhstan. Imagine living in a radioactive zone and you have no idea that's where you are living. That's the story of the Polygon. The Semipalatinsk test site was fully functional for 40 years from 1949 to 1989, but the world only got to know about it by the year 1991. The Soviet Union used to conduct the testing of nuclear bombs, and the people around had no clue. They would hear the ground shake and a mushroom cloud rise in the air. They thought broken windows were bad, but nobody told them about the dangers of the cloud inching closer to them. A rough estimate shows that the Soviet Union blasted more than 400 nuclear bombs in this site, affecting over 1.5 million people throughout the years in total. If you want that in perspective, the amount of bombs thrown at this site was 3,333 times more in size than the one dropped on Hiroshima. An area of 7,000 square miles was infected by the radiation of these bombs, and to this date, it is still infected. But here is what's interesting. The area is open to the public. Anyone can waltz to the radiation zone and nobody would bat an eye. It is free for everyone to access. Abandoned bunkers and a radioactive lake remain the two main sites where people still visit. The abandoned military town hosted around 10,000 people once, but today it looks like a haunted site with wrecked ruins and empty bunkers. Many towers still stand tall today, but have been torn down, leaving the horror stories behind. It had a lot of useful pipes and construction materials, which were stolen and sold in the market. Yes, from a radioactive site. If that scares you, take a look at the atomic lake. Here, the news is widespread that radiation is etched into the water, yet people come out here and fish for carp that have inhabited the waters. It is alive, so it is good to eat. The lake is as creepy as it could get. Dead bushes and an empty garden pushed back by barbed wire are enough to send shivers down your spine. The lake was created as a result of a detonation back in 1965. The explosion formed a massive crater, and it gives a troubling insight on how much damage a nuclear bomb can cause. People do not go there without wearing protective gear, but they go at their own risk. They have to avoid treading on sand barefoot, not wave with sand in the air, and bring it back to the site. But these abandoned locations are not the only thing that has come out of the secret testing site. What's troubling is that for years, children with disabilities have been born, and the trend continues in most locations in the country. While many have survived with no visible physical disability, their genetic map remains a big question worth researching. The elderly tell the tale of how many kids in school would mysteriously pass away. Many of them would pass away from cancer, while others would develop strange diseases. They would have no idea then, but it had become common today to go to the doctor and find out that the disease may be because of the nuclear testing. Even after the 1990s, some sites in Kazakhstan were sold to Russia for nuclear testing. The villages were not part of the testing zone, but they would be gifted with the debris of those tests. For years, many villages used to find scraps of metal and other chunks falling from the sky and near their homes. They would be sold as scrap metal, while other things were repurposed for household items. Often, the villagers would see burning objects flying from the sky, looking like a meteorite and lighting up the whole village. But they were all chunks of debris by morning. It all stopped by 2016, but the impacts of the continuous years of testing remain a mystery to this day. It is as if the world doesn't want to know how bad the news will be when it comes out. The Chernobyl of the United States. America also has a pretty toxic site. It was so bad that the locals started calling it America's Chernobyl. Decades ago, the Hanford site was a place where the production of plutonium was taking place. Today, it is one of the most contaminated places in the world and the topmost radiated areas in the United States. The amount of radioactive waste was so massive that the cleanup has been going around for years, and it is still expected to continue for at least half a century. The cleanup alone cost the government around $110 billion. They were able to remove 56 million gallons of nuclear waste stored in over 177 underground tanks. But here is where it gets troubling. The tanks are expected to leak, and the experts say that it is another Chernobyl waiting to happen and engulf the region. Just recently, a tunnel collapsed in the facility, sending the workers all over the zone into a state of utter panic. The tunnel contained 8 carts filled to the brim with radioactive waste, and a hole as big as 400 square feet had popped open due to the collapse. The 3,000 people near the collapse had been told to evacuate. There was no sign of release observed from the collapse contaminating the public areas. The same cannot be said for the workers, though. Many workers who had been part of the decontamination process have been having trouble breathing. Studies showed that people working 30 feet from the zones were in grave danger. The most disturbing city of Chernobyl. The most recorded nuclear accident in the world is that of Chernobyl. It left the world wondering how fragile the testing of such bombs is. Back in 1986, a nuclear reactor exploded and 50 tons of radioactive material quickly lifted into the air, traveling to Europe. The whole explosion was massive, and the radioactive material kept spewing into the air for 10 consecutive days. The toxicity and severity of the explosion were yet to be judged. But there was one thing that gave the investigator an idea of what a gigantic incident had taken place that day. It was called the elephant's foot. It was not an actual foot, but something that looked a lot like one. Hidden in the basement of Chernobyl was burning hot lava that was eating through the building due to its scorching temperature. However, the lava solidified and left a giant corium, uranium, sand, concrete, and other radioactive materials inside the facility. This blob was so dangerous that it could take the life of any person standing 5 minutes in its vicinity. Although there was little amount of radioactive material detected in the blob in comparison with sand and concrete, the lava-like structure was still toxic. Sources report that the investigators found this blob months after the disaster reigned terror in the region, but the blob was still burning hot. This deadly blob was measured to release around 10,000 Roentgen per hour. That is equivalent to having 4.5 million chest X-rays. Around 50 to 100 Roentgen can cause radiation sickness in a human, which is why seconds of exposure around this terrifying blob can make you sick. Even today, the giant blob is hidden under the basement of the facility and is the most dangerous radioactive waste in the world. It still emits dangerously high levels of radiation and can still affect a person the same way as it did back in the day it was formed. The Red Forest is one of the most radioactive places in the world. When the Chernobyl disaster struck, the radiation spread far and wide, colliding with the forest nearby. Reports estimate that the water, air, and soil of the forest absorbed 20 times more radioactive matter than the atomic bombs that struck Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The scary thing is that it is all evident when you walk in here. The pine trees absorbed the deadly radiation, spewing into the air and turned into deadly red skeletons. The century-old pine trees now held red leaves, scorching the life out of the whole forest. That is how the name of this forest became the Red Forest. The soil around the forest had absorbed more than 90% of the radiation, but the trees and soil were not the only victims of the radiation. Many species of birds went extinct, while hundreds of insects on the soil were killed on the spot because of the massive explosion. But the bad news didn't stop there. A lot of sites around the forest had 10 times more nuclear activity than the Chernobyl zone itself. The scary thing was that the forest could have erupted into a fire, and that would have sent the radiation across the nearby areas. Something needed to be done. So, time was taken, and military troops were called to decontaminate the forest. Special trenches were built to bury the dead wood inside and clean the area as much as possible. Over the trenches, a thick layer of sand, towering almost 10 feet and spreading across 13,000 feet, was poured. These burial sites helped contain the radiation and reduce the radioactive levels significantly. But here is where it becomes problematic. Not all the trees were buried under such trenches. There remains a huge area of the forest that was not dumped under the burial sites. You can still spot many burnt black trees lying around the soil, emitting very dangerous levels of radiation. Back in the year 2022, the Russian troops were camping in the Red Forest against their war with Ukraine. Many troops had to be treated for radiation exposure, and there was one soldier who had passed away because of the high levels of radiation in the forest. An experiment was conducted in the later years where scientists threw bags of leaves in both uncontaminated areas and contaminated areas. After a year, the scientists came back for the leaves and were astonished to find them still there in the radiated areas. The ones in the uncontaminated areas had decomposed, unlike the ones in the contaminated region, sending a shocking reminder of the high levels of radiation in these areas. But after 3 decades after the accident, there is some new life sprouting in the forest, including both fauna and flora. Apart from flora, fauna was also affected. There was a population of birds native to the area that did not become extinct, but was afflicted by a terrible mutation from the radiation. Barn swallows usually have dark feathers, but when the radiation hit the region, their populations started giving birth to birds that had light-colored feathers. This striking change was reported to be because of the radiation. Typically, melanin helps the birds fight against harmful UV rays, But with that gone due to the light feathers of these birds, scientists reported that the bird had gone through a horrifying mutation. The changes in the mutation remain unclear but show how human disasters can affect the wildlife around us. That's not all. Scientists discovered that there were many radioactive spiders inside the facility. Not only that, but they were creating radioactive webs too. If you get tangled in one, you will most probably be infected. I guess it is safe to say that it won't be anything like Spider-Man. That might be scary, but nothing was as scary as this incident that happened in Chernobyl. More than 300,000 people had evacuated when the Chernobyl disaster struck the region. Almost all of the people had witnessed something mysterious and terrifying in the skies of the region that day. And it was not just the high levels of radiation and the creepy smell of diseases floating around in the air. Many people had spotted a massive black bird with red, gleaming eyes spanning over 20 feet and flying through the night sky. It vanished right after the accident, and nobody figured out what the strange creature was that day soaring high in the sky. Many people had theories, and the best of it was that it was a bird that had mutated. But that early after the disaster, the mysterious bird left only a list of questions and no answers behind its strange appearance. But those are not the only things that are frozen in time. Many other things were found in the region that can make any grown man scared. The buildings and hospitals were abandoned after the disaster, and people had evacuated from the radiation zone, spreading thousands of miles away. But many people have gone into the middle of these zones to take a look at what was left behind, and what they found is pretty chilling. Many gas masks were found littered in the area, casting a haunting memory of the people who were suffering in the disaster. But the most creepy thing was the room filled with child-sized gas masks. There were piles and piles of these masks scattered on the floor, rising in dumps and sending a shiver down the spine. Even in schools, there were thousands of gas masks of both toddlers and babies left under dust. How eerie could it be to see this live? Inside a hospital, there is a room filled with piles and piles of clothes of the plant personnel. Only touching these clothes left many nurses and doctors exposed to the radiation. Today, the room is still there, with the clothes emitting dangerously high levels of radiation in a cold, dark basement. Some of the investigators also found heaps of dirty mattresses present on rusting beds and even human skeletons present in some corners of the zone. A large number of bottles were shelved in hospitals with liquids and other remains that must have been part of some surgeries back when the hospital was functional. But there were other jars found too, which were much more disturbing. Heaps of beakers with fish stored inside pickle jars. Nobody knows why they were being stored, but an evacuation of the city can expose some dirty secrets, no? People saw what happened when the radioactive matter leaked into the region, and there was something desperately needed to contain it. A lot of efforts were made to decontaminate the nuclear reactor and the waste that had spread around the region. One such thing was the sarcophagus. A huge structure was built around the waste to contain the nuclear matter in one place. It took 5 months and the lives of 31 construction workers to get the structure in place, but it was built to collapse. Water was already seeping through the roof, and the building did not have any proper joints. Ideas were thrown to dismantle the structure, but that would have meant that the radioactive material would be released from the empty shell. Then, after years of planning, a movable dome was built that was transported over this fragile building and was termed as the new sarcophage. This massive dome was the size of the Statue of Liberty and spanned as wide as the Wembley Stadium. The most radioactive zone in Japan. A particular disaster occurred in 2011 that detonated a nuclear reactor. This horrifying disaster left the city in a state of panic and continues to haunt the locals. There was a massive explosion of 3 reactors inside the facility, launching a disastrous amount of high-level radiation into the atmosphere. The amount was calculated to be about 1/10 of the radiation released during Chernobyl. The government asked people around a 12-mile radius to evacuate, but people were so scared that the locals living further from the radius left too. The evacuation didn't pay mercy to the residents, though. Hundreds of them passed away within a span of 90 days. When you go inside the city, there is a lot that will remind you of the terrible accident which took place years ago. Apart from the hospitals, many buildings stand erect today. Residents of the houses have to permit the government to demolish the buildings. While many have been obliterated, many houses remain standing, and the locals are allowed to live inside the house if they want. The pictures are still pasted on the walls, and many more memories of the families are still etched on the walls. A video of a grocery store went viral, where the store had been littered with cobwebs as if people hadn't stepped inside for years. The shelves were torn apart, and the groceries were splattered across the floor. The smell of the rotten food was so bad that it could be smelled from tens of feet away. People couldn't stand inside for more than 5 minutes because of the eerie sensation they got from inside the store. Lines of dusty cars stand in a hollow queue while the water runs along with the radioactive matter. But the government is now working to empty the city. Only police and construction workers are allowed in the haunted region, trying to do the cleanup. Even after years, there remain decades of work to be done to do the decontamination entirely. That's all on the radioactive zones around the world and the creepy footage that made it on the internet. What did you think about these eerie places? Which one sent you into a state of fear or made you creep out? Let us know in the comments. We would love to hear your thoughts. If you liked the video, send us some love and hit the thumbs up icon. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have a lot in store for you. Until our next upload hits your feed, goodbye, and thanks for watching.